The Pursuit of Happiness, Chapter 3 Summary. The Relative Value of Pleasures, Daniel G. Brinton. In Chapter 3 of The Pursuit of Happiness, Daniel G. Brinton examines an important question. Are all pleasures equally valuable, or are some pleasures higher and more meaningful than others? The chapter follows Brinton's discussion of what happiness actually means in Chapter 2. He now develops the idea that human enjoyment has different levels, ranging from physical sensations to emotional and intellectual experiences. However, he warns against making the mistake of completely rejecting lower pleasures in favor of supposedly higher ones. Project Gutenberg +1. 1. The hierarchy of pleasures. Brinton begins by comparing the study of happiness to the hierarchy of sciences. Scientists often arrange different branches of knowledge according to their relationships and increasing complexity. Brinton proposes something similar for happiness. He suggests that there is a kind of hierarchy of human enjoyments. In simple terms, pleasures can be understood as progressing roughly from physical sensations, right arrow emotions, right arrow intellectual enjoyment. The pleasures of the senses belong to our basic animal nature. Emotional pleasures are more complex, involving love, sympathy, friendship, and other feelings. Intellectual pleasures arise from thinking, understanding, discovering, and pursuing truth. Brinton's point is not simply that one pleasure is good and another is bad. Instead, he wants us to understand how different forms of enjoyment depend upon different human faculties. 2. The danger of condemning pleasure. Brinton strongly criticizes philosophies and religions that condemn pleasure altogether. According to him, two opposite mistakes are possible. Mistake 1, rejecting pleasure. Some philosophies teach people to suppress or eliminate desire and enjoyment. Mistake 2, chasing only low forms of pleasure. Other people reduce happiness to immediate physical gratification. Brinton believes both approaches are harmful. The first denies an important part of human nature. The second prevents people from developing the richer capacities that can provide deeper forms of enjoyment. Therefore, the goal should not be avoid pleasure, nor should it be get as much immediate pleasure as possible. Instead, understand and develop the different forms of pleasure. 3. Brinton's criticism of extreme asceticism. One of Brinton's targets is asceticism, the belief that pleasure and bodily enjoyment should be suppressed because they are morally or spiritually dangerous. He discusses traditions that treat desire itself as something that should ultimately disappear. Brinton particularly mentions Buddhism as an example of a philosophy whose highest ideal, in his interpretation, involves escaping desire and enjoyment. Project Gutenberg. Brinton disagrees with the idea that eliminating desire is the proper path to human happiness. Why? Because human life itself involves desires, sensations, emotions, and activities. To completely reject pleasure would mean rejecting important aspects of human existence. For Brinton, the better approach is to cultivate our natural faculties rather than attempt to destroy them. 4. But the opposite extreme is also wrong. Brinton is not saying every pleasure should be pursued without limits. That would create another problem. A person who spends his entire life chasing immediate sensory gratification may neglect intellectual development, emotional relationships, creativity, knowledge, meaningful work, self-awareness, personal growth. Such a person might experience many pleasurable moments while still failing to develop a genuinely rich and happy life. Therefore, Brinton wants a balanced approach. 5 physical pleasures are the foundation. Brinton begins his hierarchy with sensory pleasures. These include experiences connected with our physical senses: taste, smell, touch, sight, sound, physical comfort, and activity. These pleasures are basic because they belong to the physical side of human nature. They should not automatically be considered inferior or shameful. A good meal, beautiful music, physical exercise, a pleasant environment, or other sensory experiences can contribute to happiness. However, they are only one part of the whole picture. 6. Emotional pleasures are more complex. Above basic sensory enjoyment are the pleasures of emotion. Human beings experience emotions such as love, friendship, affection, sympathy, admiration, hope, excitement, compassion. These experiences are more complex because they involve relationships between ourselves and other people, or between ourselves and ideas, memories, and hopes. For example, the pleasure of eating something delicious may last only a short time. But the happiness that comes from friendship can influence a person's life for years. This doesn't mean that sensory pleasure has no value. It means that human beings have developed capacities that allow us to experience much richer forms of enjoyment. 7. Intellectual pleasures. At another level are the pleasures associated with the intellect. These include learning, discovering, reasoning, understanding, creating, solving problems, appreciating ideas, searching for truth. Brinton considers intellectual enjoyment especially important because it is associated with the highest development of human faculties. The pursuit of truth can itself become a source of happiness. For example, imagine a person struggling to understand a difficult subject. At first, there is confusion. Then suddenly, the idea becomes clear. That moment of understanding can produce a powerful form of satisfaction. The pleasure comes not from possessing a physical object, but from the development of the mind. 8. Higher pleasures depend upon lower ones. This is one of the most important points in the chapter. Although Brinton describes different levels of pleasure, higher pleasures cannot completely separate themselves from lower ones. A human being is a whole organism. Our physical condition affects our emotions. Our emotions affect our thinking. Our thinking can influence our emotions and physical behavior. Therefore, we cannot simply say, I will ignore my body and live entirely through my intellect. The different faculties are connected. Brinton explicitly emphasizes that the various forms of pleasure are inseparably united in the individual. Project Gutenberg. 9. Everyone has different capacities. Another important point is that people do not possess exactly the same abilities. One person may have an exceptionally strong intellectual capacity. Another may have extraordinary artistic ability. Someone else may experience deep emotional satisfaction through relationships. Another person may have a particular talent for physical activity. Brinton says that people can enjoy only through the faculties they possess, and the strength of those faculties differs between individuals. Project Gutenberg. This means we should not expect everyone to experience happiness in exactly the same way. A person cannot simply be told, you must enjoy what I enjoy. People have different constitutions, interests, and abilities. 10. The hierarchy does not mean that lower pleasures are worthless. This is a subtle but important point. When Brinton describes intellectual pleasures as higher, he does not mean that sensory pleasures should be destroyed. For example, reading a great book may provide intellectual pleasure. But while reading, you are still a physical person. You need food, sleep, physical comfort, movement, health. Similarly, emotional happiness does not eliminate physical needs. The human being experiences all these dimensions simultaneously. Therefore, the ideal life should not consist of completely abandoning lower pleasures. Instead, the different pleasures should be brought into harmony. 11. Why some people fail to become happier. Brinton believes that misunderstanding the hierarchy of pleasures can damage people's lives. Consider two extremes. Person A. He lives almost entirely for physical gratification. His goals are food, entertainment, comfort, and immediate enjoyment. He may have many pleasures, but little intellectual or emotional development. Person B. He believes all physical enjoyment is beneath him. He suppresses every ordinary pleasure and tries to live entirely through abstract ideals. He may become frustrated, unhealthy, or disconnected from ordinary human experience. Brinton's ideal lies somewhere between these extremes. A complete human life should develop the whole person. 12. Contentment is not the same as happiness. Brinton also distinguishes contentment from genuine happiness. A person might say, "I don't want anything. I'm satisfied with whatever I have." At first, this sounds like happiness. But Brinton warns that complete indifference to pleasure may actually indicate a lack of vitality. A person who has lost the capacity to desire, enjoy, or become excited about anything may not be truly happy. This is why Brinton does not consider simple contentment sufficient. Contentment: I don't need anything more. Happiness: I am alive, engaged, developing, and capable of enjoying life. The second condition is much closer to Brinton's ideal. 13. Indifference to pleasure can be a sign of weakness. This is a particularly interesting idea. We often assume that a person who doesn't care about pleasure must be spiritually or mentally superior. Brinton challenges this assumption. If a person is completely incapable of experiencing pleasure, that may not be wisdom. It could indicate emotional exhaustion, mental weakness, loss of vitality, lack of sensitivity, illness, or an impoverished inner life. A healthy person should retain some capacity for enjoyment. The goal is therefore not to destroy sensitivity, but to develop and properly direct it. 14. Happiness means expansion and growth. This is probably the central philosophical idea of Chapter 3. Brinton connects happiness with expansion plus growth plus development. A truly happy life should not become smaller and smaller. It should become richer. A person's range of experiences can expand through education, travel, friendship, art, science, reading, work, creativity, love, reflection. The more human faculties we develop, the more possible sources of enjoyment we can discover. Therefore, Brinton's ideal of happiness is not passive. It is dynamic. 15. A simple example of expansion. Imagine someone who enjoys only one activity. Suppose that person loves watching movies, but has no interest in reading, music, nature, friendship, learning, or creative work. His sources of pleasure are limited. Now imagine that he develops several interests: reading books, learning a language, exercising, listening to music, making videos, meeting friends, studying philosophy, traveling. His potential sources of happiness have multiplied. If one source temporarily disappears, others remain. This is the kind of expansion of the sources of enjoyment that Brinton values. 16. The practical problem: how do we compare pleasures? Brinton recognizes a difficult question. Suppose one person says, "Eating delicious food gives me the greatest happiness." Another says, "Learning gives me the greatest happiness." Who is correct? Can we objectively rank their pleasures? Brinton acknowledges that comparing pleasures is difficult because individuals have different constitutions and abilities. A pleasure that is extremely powerful for one person may be almost meaningless to another. Therefore, there cannot always be a simple mathematical scale for human enjoyment. 17. Yet a hierarchy is still useful. Even though exact comparison is difficult, Brinton believes the hierarchy remains useful. Why? because it helps us recognize that human beings possess different levels of capacity. A person can develop from primarily seeking sensory enjoyment toward appreciating emotional and intellectual experiences. This is not about condemning earlier stages. It is about expanding the range of experience. For Brinton, the best life is one in which a person develops as many healthy capacities for enjoyment as possible. 18. The problem with higher vs lower thinking. Brinton's argument contains an important warning. Once we create a hierarchy, we might begin saying, "This pleasure is respectable, that pleasure is worthless." Brinton rejects this simplistic attitude. He says that all the roads to happiness are interconnected. We cannot successfully pursue one while completely neglecting the others. A person who wants intellectual happiness still needs a functioning body. A person who wants emotional happiness still needs sensory experience. A person who wants physical happiness can benefit from emotional and intellectual development. Thus, the hierarchy should be understood as a relationship among different forms of enjoyment, not as a command to reject everything considered lower. 19. Brinton's criticism of artificial discipline. Brinton also criticizes people who believe that ordinary enjoyment should be postponed until holidays or vacations. For example, some people think, "Work is serious, enjoyment is allowed only after work." Brinton considers this unnecessarily restrictive. Why should a person divide life into work equals suffering and holiday equals happiness? Instead, he believes our daily activities themselves should contain opportunities for enjoyment. Work can provide achievement, social interaction, learning, creativity, satisfaction. The goal should be to make life itself richer rather than waiting for occasional escapes from it. 20. Improve your natural faculties. Brinton presents an alternative to both asceticism and mindless pleasure-seeking. Develop your natural faculties. If you have intellectual ability, develop it. If you have artistic ability, cultivate it. If you have social abilities, strengthen your relationships. If you have physical abilities, keep your body active. If you have curiosity, learn. The development of these capacities creates additional opportunities for happiness. This is a major theme that continues into later chapters of the book. 21. Happiness is not about maximum pleasure at every moment. Brinton's philosophy does not suggest that we should maximize pleasure every second. Sometimes we need to work. Sometimes we need discipline. Sometimes we need to delay gratification. Sometimes we need to tolerate discomfort. The purpose is not to eliminate all unpleasantness. The purpose is to create a life in which different activities contribute to a richer overall experience. This idea becomes especially important later in the book when Brinton discusses suffering and the inseparable relationship between pleasure and pain. 22. Connection with Chapter 2. Chapter 2 argued that happiness is more than simple pleasure. Chapter 3 now asks, if pleasure is part of happiness, what kinds of pleasure are available to human beings? Brinton's answer is that pleasure exists on several interconnected levels. Chapter 2. Happiness not equal to simple pleasure. Chapter 3. Pleasure itself has different forms and relationships. The broader conclusion. A happy life develops and integrates the whole person. This progression makes Chapter 3 essential for understanding the rest of the book. 23. The chapter's practical philosophy. Brinton's advice can be translated into modern language. Don't reject pleasure. Enjoy healthy experiences without unnecessary guilt. Don't become a slave to pleasure. Immediate gratification isn't the same as happiness. Develop your mind. Intellectual curiosity creates new forms of enjoyment. Develop your emotions. Friendship, love, and compassion enrich life. Look after your body. Physical health supports other forms of happiness. Keep expanding. Don't allow your life to become narrower and narrower. Cultivate variety. Different experiences stimulate different faculties. Integrate everything. Don't separate physical, emotional, and intellectual life into completely isolated compartments. 24. The deepest lesson of Chapter 3. Brinton is ultimately arguing against two incomplete visions of happiness. Vision 1, pleasure is bad. This leads to excessive self-denial and asceticism. Vision 2, pleasure is everything. This leads to shallow gratification and the neglect of higher human capacities. Brinton proposes a third approach. Pleasure is valuable, but human beings should develop the full range of their faculties. The aim is not to have the maximum number of pleasurable sensations. The aim is to have a rich, expanding, and fully developed life. Chapter 3, summary in one paragraph. In Chapter 3, The Relative Value of Pleasures, Daniel G. Brinton examines the different forms of pleasure and their importance to happiness. He argues that pleasures can be viewed in a hierarchy, beginning with sensory pleasures, moving through emotional pleasures, and reaching intellectual enjoyment. However, he warns against both extremes, philosophies that condemn pleasure entirely and lifestyles that pursue only low or immediate forms of gratification. Physical, emotional, and intellectual pleasures are interconnected because they belong to the same human being, and individuals differ in their capacities to experience them. Brinton argues that complete happiness is associated with the expansion and growth of the self, rather than simple contentment or passive comfort. Indifference to pleasure can even indicate a loss of vitality. Although comparing the value of different pleasures is difficult, people should cultivate their natural faculties and expand their sources of enjoyment. The ideal is therefore not to reject lower pleasures or blindly chase them, but to integrate the different forms of enjoyment into a richer and more developed human life. Project Gutenberg. One-line takeaway. True happiness does not come from rejecting pleasure or chasing only easy pleasure. It comes from developing the whole person and expanding the ways in which we can enjoy life. The chapter is officially titled The Relative Value of Pleasures and is Chapter III of Part 1, Happiness as the Aim of Life. Project Gutenberg +1.